Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in APAC and California. We're very much looking forward to today's discussion, which is going to be focused on Australia's energy markets. We've got two guests in today. Number one is Skipp Williamson. Skipp's a legend in the Australian consulting and advisory space. The Australian Financial Review had her as the most influential consultant in the country in 2019. She runs Partners in Performance after having founded the firm back in 1996. It's a global strategy and operations consultancy that has deep expertise in the global and Australian energy space. In particular, they've worked extensively with big energy users on decarbonising their own supply chains, as well as on low-cost hydrogen production options. Prior to PIP, she was at McKinsey and she studied at Oxford, MIT and the University of Auckland and was an engineer by training. Welcome, Skipp.
Thanks, Hugo.
Our second guest today is Brian Innes, also from PIP. Brian's the Global Technical Director for Partners in Performance's Energy Transformation Practice. Brian has a long history in Australian energy, from developing assets, particularly behind the meter and off-grid renewable projects, to energy efficiency offerings, to market and grid analysis, to developing a virtual power plant business, which is still the largest VPP in Western Australia. Welcome, Brian.
Nice to meet you, Hugo.
Let's jump straight in then, team, and talk a little bit about large energy users in Australia. You work with a lot of them on reducing their emissions, building on-site generation and contracting directly with generators. In the Australian context, what are the biggest challenges for our big energy users, our mines, our aluminium smelters, to decarbonise their electricity supply?
Yeah, thanks, Hugo. We see it as less of a challenge and more of great opportunities for our large clients. And certainly in the mining space, we've done 288 site roadmaps now. And for most of them, we can get them in the order of, if you look at their electricity, 80% plus renewable power, MPV positive. And so, that in itself is a great story. Who wouldn't want those kind of investments? But secondly, once the capital is paid back, then the cost savings can be so significant, given there's no minimal variable cost, that we're actually seeing mines, gold mines, for example, actually increasing their mine life as a result of the reduced energy costs. So we see this far more as opportunity-rich than challenge-rich.
And when you're talking about working with 288 mines, and Brian, maybe this is one for you, what kind of solutions are you offering them? Is it a combination of renewables, batteries, gas peakers, or when you're offering these solutions, it really is kind of clean?
Oh, it's got to be hybridized. So it's always going to have a wind element, solar element, storage element, and then you got to deal with the events to make sure there's always power when they need it. So you will have an element of fossil, although the fossil elements are moving towards whether it's diesel or gas or many are now looking at sustainable fuels and biofuels and others as the fossil component.
I mean, obviously, and this has been a big theme on Aurora's podcast over the last month or so, supply chains are tight, CapEx has jumped for all the technologies we've just talked about. Is that impacting the way you guys do things? Are people pausing on some of these programs to wait for some of these supply chain issues to, kind of unravel themselves, or are they just cracking on and accepting slightly higher costs for the next 12, 24 months, whatever it might be?
I think the supply chain's opening up. So there's a number of elements of the supply chain that are having issues. I think what's currently happening in Europe is a bit of an existential crisis, and there's reasons why a lot of the European suppliers are feeding their home market as they all go through a lot more pressure for the transition than normal. But the other components, so things like panels and turbines and others, those are there and available. The issue for timing is generally internal decision making, not external supply.
I assume you work with, clearly an enormous variety of customers and varying degrees of sophistication. And I'm sure at kind of one end, it's, I want some solar panels here to reduce my consumption of fossil fuels, through to more sophisticated requirements where there is a genuine need for 24/7 power that has to be matched. And maybe Australia's not quite there yet, because I'm thinking a little bit more of the Googles of the world who are, genuinely trying to match 24/7 clean power. Could you just describe the spectrum of sophistication of clients that you're working with? Or am I overthinking it and actually they're all just looking for NPV positive and trying to get 80, 90% of the way there?
Most of our clients are very flat loads. So, and what we've found is the most economic is to push to as close to 24/7 as you can. The more renewable you can get into it, which means you do need, look, I don't think there's a solution we've designed at all in the last 3 years that's just solar. It'd be very rare that would actually make sense economically. You really are trying to push as much in as you can. So you're looking at that combination of wind and solar and storage, and then filling in the gaps. The 24/7 commitments are really about, it's really a comment on PPAs. We do see a fundamental flaw in a lot of the PPA thinking that clients are using an annualized certificate to become 100% green, which is clearly not 100%, which is where the Googles and the Apples and the 24/7 commitments are moving. And we think by 2030, that'll be the norm, not the other way around. So most of our work with clients is we're pushing them to 24/7 already physically, as opposed to trying to deal with it contractually as others have done.
We are working from mining, oil and gas, through the big industrial users, right through to property developers, large property portfolios, retail, universities, hospitals. So, this applies across the full spectrum.
And for the grid connected people and the smaller users, like the property sector, where they don't have the ability to put wind turbines in the back garden, they are looking at a blend of what they can do for themselves and what they can do with the grid. But the interesting dynamic in Australia is the 80% of all solar is sitting on rooftop small scale. So there's a fundamental question about the Australian market about what are we going to do in terms of recognising this as clean energy, because it's currently not recognised for people who are looking for an LGC solution to their green claims, when 80% of our energy is considered to be, which is coming from solar cells sitting on all the rooftops of businesses and mums and dads. That we need to find a way to get that certified so that can be recognised.
And I'm sure it varies enormously by clients, but I assume some demand side response is also a feature of the optimization you're performing, where there is some load flexibility. You build that in a systematic way.
Look, 100%. And once we start looking at storage devices behind the meter, electrical vehicle charging behind the meter, and electrification of heat, that also has an awful lot of flexibility in it, because there's a natural storage reservoir in the heat, which we've been doing for cooling for years. When we work with our clients, we bring all of those value streams to the table so that they can understand that the full economics of an investment behind the meter, which once you bring them all to the table, it always invariably makes it a good investment.
Just sort of building on that, it's also not like, oh, we've got a little bit of excess, we can trade that and support the grid in various ways. For many of our clients, it's what's the infrastructure you've got? How can we maximize that? And very often what you're doing for the site is quite a small portion of the renewables that are going in are actually servicing your clients' direct needs.
And just out of interest, I know PIP's got a broad geographic footprint. You've done a lot of work in Australia. Where else are you doing these kind of behind the meter optimizations for big industrial users?
One of the markets that is absolutely in need at the moment is the South African market. There's clearly lots of troubles with their grid, lots of troubles with reliability in their grid. And they've recently, in the last couple of years, opened up the ability for mining industrial clients to put big behind the meter infrastructure in place. So our South African team is doing a lot of work in that space, helping clients work through their energy options and work through how to get themselves reliability and clean energy at the same time, because those two are forming together. And when you do a large hybrid renewable behind the meter project, you invariably end up with not just clean energy, but more reliable energy at the same time, because you're bringing all the infrastructure tools to the cabinet. The other one is Europe. Europe is unfortunately land constrained, but they're in desperate need of electrons. So any customers that we have up there who have ability to do stuff on site, they're exploring all of those, and it's a very hot market at the moment.
If we think of Latin America, similar situation, and then in the US, there's large pockets of the US where this is suitable. And then the other one that I find interesting is in Canada, for example, or in places where, in theory, people go, oh, I'm sorted, I've got hydro. So it's already green. I'm interested in your comment, but I think it's wasteful to be using hydro for 24/7 power when you could be using it as the firming power for the system. So I think even sites with hydro should be looking at whether they don't move on site for a large portion and sell that firming power back to the system.
100% agree with that. And I think if you look at the biggest electricity consumers as an industry would be the aluminium industry. 3 or 4 years ago, they were all, they pretty much gave up on everywhere other than hydro places. But they've really opened their mind up now, and they're really seeing that actually wind and solar can be the primary cheapest form, and using hydro for firming is a more sensible path.
We've talked a little bit about the demand side and large users. Let's maybe switch to the kind of grid scale supply side. Australia's not unique in that our vertically integrated utilities have had a relatively tough time of it over the last decade. Globally, I haven't seen like a huge number of utilities nail the energy transition. AGL in Australia in particular has had a lot of debate around the timings of its coal closures. There have been kind of raids from Mike Cannon-Brookes, as one of Australia's wealthiest people who made his money in technology. It's quite a complex space that's playing out in a fairly haphazard way, I suppose, and that's arguably been because for the last decade we haven't had great climate and energy policy integrated. But Brian, maybe a question for you. Like, what do you think Australia's gen tailors, as we call them here, got right over the last 10 years, and what did they get wrong?
It's a big question. Look, I think there is a fundamental different type of operating strategy needed for a grid that has lots and lots of small things rather than a couple of big things all moving in one direction. And I think some of them tried to get into that, but I think the early activities were all about a land grab, and they didn't sit back and go, hang on a second, what are we good at? What are we not good at? Where can we win? Where can we not? And the solar space in particular, I mean, that was such a decentralized small market where lots of operators doing stuff in a very well-regulated market, which has allowed that to happen. And that they really struggled in that space. And the same thing, VPP, I mean, some of them moved into that relatively early with great fanfare, did a bunch of pilots, but they haven't sat back and gone, well, what do we do? What do we get others to do? And they've had a bit of a turf war between them and networks and others. So there's been a few guerrillas all fighting over who's going to control it, when underneath it, the reality is this is a market that's really suited to small and nimble and agile, not big bureaucracies.
Interesting. I mean, it has, and I always stress on these podcasts, I think one of the many features that makes Australia's energy market unique is the penetration of rooftop solar and increasingly behind the meter batteries. So something like 1 in 4, 1 in 3 houses. So that VPP space, which is quite niche in other markets, I think, is an enormous opportunity in Australia. So some context there. Are there business models that you guys see winning globally? So, there seem to be some archetypes emerging, like the scale renewable developers, your Iberdrolas, your Ørsteds, some of your kind of agile tech-enabled gen tailors. I'm thinking here a bit more of NextEra and Octopus, who we hear a lot about and who have partnered with Origin here in Australia. There's a lot of talk about the VPP aggregator model. And as you say, it seems like smaller, nimbler players are winning there. I mean, are those a fair set of archetypes? Like, who do you see winning, I suppose, or will it just be different winners in different categories?
Absolutely. The big global scale where have got, the ones that can go and buy gigawatts a year from their solar wind turbines are in a strong position. There isn't really a geographical advantage for operating a wind or a solar plant. These things are naturally remotely controlled. So you can run a global fleet comfortably. So I think that is a trend that will continue. I think ultimately you'll see consolidation, and you'll see these big global players that are able to push out many gigawatts a year, having an advantage on both supply chain and on cost of capital. The other end of the grid, so that's the big energy supply, primarily big wind turbine producers, for example. But at the other end, if you look at the Australian model, so much of our solar resources are on rooftop. That's something that they can't go after. And if we start coupling that with batteries and electric vehicles, the distribution system and assets connected to the distribution system is going to be the dominant part of our grid, as opposed to the big global scale developers which are connected to the transmission system. And so a lot of flow will be happening within that system. And that really lends itself to technology-driven, agile, and service-driven. I mean, people get excited about hardware, they get excited about software, but you need to have those with service on top of it because you're dealing with human beings. And the analogy I give is the mobile phones. I mean, Apple came very late to mobile phones, but they bought hardware, software, and service into a package and just absolutely destroyed Nokia and Ericsson, which were the incumbents by far.
To turn to Australian regulation and policy, we're often quite negative about some of the regulation and policy that's been enacted in this country. I think all countries have struggled to adapt to the pace and scale of the energy transition. So Australia is certainly not alone. Maybe to put a slightly more positive spin in it, what do you think Australia has got right over the last 10 years on the policy and regulation front?
I would probably say, in defence of Australia's regulatory environment, we've got some really good policy thinkers who've been seeing the issues and talking about the issues for a long time. And so I think we actually have a lot of good thinking work. We've got a lot of good analysis that's been done on what are the changes and what it means and what the costs are. And so we do have a pretty good fact base. Where we're probably a little bit behind others, and we are forced to move faster just because of the solar uptake. But we haven't had the EV uptake of others, but we've been forced to move for that reason. We probably have struggled a little bit on implementation of change, and there's some structural reasons attached to that, to how rule changes come through the NEM, and there's some other issues across to that. And so I don't think it's the policymakers which are really struggling. I think it's just the political environment's been a bit tricky over the last few years. However, there's some hope. I think we've got to seem to have an appetite for change amongst our policy implementers. And we are very much seeing globally some of the changes from in particular, the moving from a network operating thinking, let's put things on our app, to a more DSO thinking where they're a service operator, where they're buying multiple services from others. That thinking's there. The implementation will come through. The UK and New Zealand a little bit ahead of us, but we can rapidly catch up if we want to.
Yeah, I'd pick up on two of your observations there. I completely agree on the quality of the analysis and the transparency of data, which I think is actually incredibly important. And AEMO's integrated system plan, I think, is genuinely world leading in the quality of its modelling and the thought that goes into it. The second thing I'd pick up is the governance point. I often reflect on the UK that if you get the minister, the department, and Ofgem lined up, you can pretty much do anything. Whereas, again, for our overseas listeners, Australia has a federal and state system. The states are often in disagreement with the feds. The states are often in disagreement with one another. And so there's just extra layers of complexity. And I think that governance really does matter. The US has a similar dynamic, but then it's at such a different scale that markets can genuinely just go off and do its own thing. Like California is radically different to Texas. And so they're not constrained by operating in the same way, whereas the NEM is reasonably small and actually has to have some consistency to create meaningful trade between markets, I think. So, I always thought that governance point was slightly overrated until I've seen it play out in a few different contexts, and totally agree with you. Maybe to move to the next question. So state and federal governments are ramping up the level of direct interventions in the market. So Australia's quite a pure and volatile wholesale-only market. The price floor is minus $1,000. The price cap is a bit above 15 grand. So a bit more like Texas, for example, in that way. But over the last kind of 3 or 4 years, probably with the New South Wales roadmap, a plan to build 12 gigawatts through state procurement, we've seen states start to more directly buy or at least contract with assets in the market. So they're bringing back some version of the State Electricity Corporation in Victoria. Queensland's got an aggressive energy and jobs plan. The feds want to invest directly in transmission to accelerate the build out of transmission. Are you broadly positive on these developments in that we needed some interventions to accelerate the transition to hit net zero by 2035 in our electricity system? Or are you a bit more pessimistic in that we're kind of fundamentally distorting the market and this might crowd out some private investment? Do you have a position on that spectrum?
The state to federal policy decisions is a little bit to do with this governance problem that you talked about, Hugo. And I think people are getting frustrated with that. And so we are seeing state governments going, look, we see the rule changing process at a national level is complicated, so we're going to have to do some workarounds with some state government-based programs, primarily focused on reliability. And absolutely through this transition, making sure that we've got the right mechanisms and the right incentives to ensure the investments reliability of the grid happen are critical, absolutely critical. We can't have a grid. We do not want to be living like South Africa is at the moment, that's for sure. I think the South African example is it's taken about $10 billion off their GDP just from reliability issues already.
Yeah, extraordinary.
However, we probably do look at it slightly differently in that we think a lot of the investments which are focusing on Australia solving their own decarbonisation problem, which is where the focus has been in the conversation, we think the conversation needs to be a little bit bigger. When we look at Australia's role in decarbonising the planet, we can just look at our own little footprint, or we can look at actually the opportunity we have to actually do some significant things. And when we look at that, we can actually, Australia as a continent which has got plenty of space, and I've just been up in Europe, and they cannot solve their problem by themselves. They're going to need people to help them. But the problems we can solve when we narrow them down really are, what can we do to make metals greener? What can we do to make fertilizer and explosives? What can we do to ensure that our shipping and aviation, that everything that comes in goes out with green fuel? Solving those problems is a 20% of global emission problem. We can make a significant dent on global emissions by focusing on that and moving the conversation away from almost like a restriction conversation to an expansion conversation. And really what we need to see is the state and federal governments working together to open that up and really open up the investment and open up reducing risk and allowing global money to come in and get through approvals processes and get through a simple pathway for them to make very big investments. There's going to be $10 trillion US spent in this transformation. There's a reasonably good probability that if Australia does the right things now and the state and federal level, that we can roll out the red carpet and get a good hunk to that here.
Again, this is a question where I think Australia is not unique, but there has been quite a lot of debate about the quality of carbon offsets in this country, and a few big reports have been quite critical of some of the tranches of carbon offsets that have been authenticated and put on the market. This is a really tricky challenge, but is this something that you guys have a view on, like how you run better processes to give, ultimate buyers confidence that there's a real offset there?
Yeah, we certainly do, Hugo. We are doing a lot of work in that space, increasingly so with the recent shifts in regulation around the safeguard mechanism, which has been tightened in Australia. This is a mechanism effectively defining people's baselines with a pseudo carbon price. I guess when we look at the integrity of carbon offsets, we see there's two different aspects to it. The first one is the integrity of the actual climate solution, what's actually being implemented on the ground. And the second one is the integrity of the carbon accounting approach, which is being used to quantify the climate impact of the solution. So taking each of those in turn, if you look at the integrity of the actual solution, I guess we see this as coming down to some fundamental questions around, does the intervention have a material impact on greenhouse gas emissions or on sequestration? What's the motivation behind doing it? How are other aspects being considered? We look at biodiversity, natural capital, community development, human rights, legal titles, agricultural action, and so on. And where is the money which comes from those credits flowing and who's going to benefit? So when we look at our solutions there for our clients, either building them or buying them, we're looking on those dimensions to sort of stare down the barrel of the integrity of the solution. And then in terms of the accounting integrity, again, we're looking at a series of questions. Which carbon credit system is the project going to use and why? What are the assumptions that define the baseline and are they reasonable? How conservative is the qualification methods for different interventions? And I guess how do the resulting carbon credits sit with the host nations, national accounting systems, and so on. So there's a bunch of questions or lenses that we apply when we're looking at prioritizing, because of course there's usually not just one option you're looking at, but a series and a portfolio that you're building.
Yeah, and this certainly isn't an area of expertise for me. I mean, Aurora looks at this, but it's often an input into the modeling in terms of what price you might get for a carbon certificate for green power. So we're not doing that kind of analysis. Will there be a kind of tightening of standards in Australia over time? It kind of feels like there has to be, and that more of the things you just described are factored into, what policymakers will or won't authenticate.
Almost inevitably, firstly, to deal with the noise that's swirling in Australia on this, and secondly, because it's an industry that accounting firms would love to drive. So I think inevitably that will in turn drive policy.
Yeah, I think we're seeing the voluntary market already is that companies are setting their standards. So the companies we're working with, they're actually driving the standards far higher than because of the risk attached to getting it wrong. So I think you'll see a few tiers of standards. So for companies looking to make green claims, they will be running the highest standard. If you're just looking to meet your safeguarding obligation and you need some credits to do something with compliance, then you'll have a different standard.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, and it's almost a cliche now, there's a lot of hype about hydrogen, the different roles it might play. I suppose, where do you sit on the spectrum of kind of pessimism versus optimism? And particularly, hydrogen for domestic consumption in Australia versus hydrogen as an export opportunity for Australia to, presumably Asia or wherever the demand is?
Look, it's a great question because I think there's a lot of hype and hyperbole in this space. Look, our assessment, looking globally, of how we sit, is that it is going to be a globally competitive space. Absolutely. So we are probably almost convinced that it's unlikely that you're going to sell hydrogen and someone's going to turn it to electron somewhere else. So our focus really is on the end users of hydrogen, not the hydrogen itself. And so we do most of our analysis at, well, what are the markets that need hydrogen if they're going to go down a green pathway? So at the moment, steel and nickel and a few other metals use that as a reductant. Absolutely, they're going to have to move off carbon reductants and move to hydrogen reductants. Fertilizers and explosives, they must move off natural gas or coal-based fertilizers and explosives and move to a green hydrogen molecule into those spaces. And aviation and maritime fuels are also ones where are more than likely going to head down either an ammonia or a methanol or a sustainable aviation fuel kind of pathway, which will require a green hydrogen molecule to be produced as part of that. When you look at those sectors just in their own right, it's a huge opportunity. Right? And so I think there's this, that people get mixed up with this. We're going to become a hydrogen superpower and export hydrogen in the world. Well, we kind of will, but we're going to be an end product superstar because there's no reason we couldn't be a huge exporter of iron rather than iron ore. There's no reason we couldn't be exporting fertilizer to our local markets, to Australia, Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia, those sorts of things, which we'll need a lot of fertilizer for food. Clearly, we use a lot of explosives, so we should be making more of those ourselves, and maybe exporting some of those around the world as well. And then we are a long way from most places, so we should be looking at shipping and aviation fuels naturally and producing them here to make sure we're refilling with our own fuels and not importing fuel to refill. So if you look at those sectors, they're about 20-25% of global emissions.
Yeah.
So we can play a significant part. And then if we look at what energy would be required to produce the hydrogen to meet what we could be doing quite locally, to be honest, just reducing our iron ore and looking at our ships and planes and fertilizer in our sort of immediate markets, it's a $1 trillion opportunity. So whilst we're sounding pessimistic, we're very optimistic about the investment opportunity, but we don't get as caught up in the superpower kind of language as others might.
Yeah. As ever, the best answers are nuanced ones. I think there is a slightly kind of reductivist debate going on where people are looking at the IRA, which is very generous in terms of subsidies, both for renewables, but also for hydrogen, and saying, well, the US is going to win. I suspect that the answer is slightly more complicated than that for the reasons you've just described.
If there's one lesson that hopefully the energy world is learning, is you don't put all your eggs in one basket with energy security. And so I think it's quite reasonable to think there'll be a very strong North American hydrogen industry. There'll be a very strong South African, North African will both be quite strong. South America's got wonderful opportunities. Places like Kazakhstan have wonderful opportunities. And the Middle East has wonderful opportunities, and that's Australia. And I think it makes sense for all of them to take 10-15% of that opportunity, which is a lazy $1 trillion investment. And that actually makes a global market that will make sense. The subsidies are exciting to get things moving, but ultimately we need to plan for a subsidy-free world, and you need to look at the fundamentals. But we also need to be honest with ourselves and say, look, we have sun in Australia, but we're not the only country that gets the sun. And we have wind, so we do need to make sure we're an attractive place to invest in addition to having sun and wind, because we do have one Achilles heel, which is we've got very high labour rates. So we need to find a way to build our hydrogen cheap enough in a high labour environment.
Yeah, it's a terrific point. And I also think on the buyer side, Aurora's launching in Japan. We're talking to a lot of Japanese policymakers. They're very keen to talk about hydrogen ammonia from Australia. But I think they are pursuing a strategy where clearly they want as many suppliers as possible. They don't want to recreate the dynamic of the LNG industry. Why would they? So, they're going to want a diversified portfolio of suppliers. I'm sure Australia will play a part in that in certain niches, but no, completely agree. Maybe some kind of more general and, again, slightly rapid fire questions to finish off, because I'm conscious of time. What's one view each of you have that you think is out of consensus versus conventional wisdom in the energy space? So somewhere you think you're swimming a little bit against the tide in terms of the conventional wisdom of energy nerds.
Maybe not energy nerds, but I guess, Brian, one of the areas that I think we seldom arrive at a client and don't have to shift is the conception. We're not greatly fond of PPAs for clients who have sites. I think PPA is probably fabulous if you're on level 24 of a high-rise office building. But in general, I think people are confusing, I don't want to own and operate my electricity with, therefore, I should contract through a PPA far, far away. We're generally of the view that the best place for electricity to be generated is on site.
And Brian, one from you?
It's probably on the hydrogen story. This perception that Australia has this massive advantage. We just don't. Right? There's lots of places on this planet with solar and wind. We're going to have to be really smart. We're going to have to get the red carpet out and find a way to make people invest in $10 billion projects. There is no such thing as a small hydrogen project. They are all super massive. When we were developing the LNG industry in West Australia, our Prime Minister was in China lobbying for contracts. Like this is how getting this kind of money and these kinds of projects in Australia, we need to have a full frontal effort to make Australia investable. And we need to make sure we do everything we can to make it as easy as possible so we don't miss out.
Completely agree. And I do think some of these narratives around hydrogen superpower, 1,000 terawatt hours of demand for hydrogen, it sometimes creates an inevitability in what is just a very speculative forecast. So again, agree with you there. Final question. Is there anyone you read or listen to in the energy space that you think is always good, thought-provoking and relevant to your work in the private sector? Anyone that springs to mind?
How do you answer that? Look, I think, for us, we have a large internal team that is constantly in the market, literally buying, contracting every day solving new problems, and all of them constantly reading. So I guess we're in a luxurious position where we have this stream of facts coming past every day.
And no one too nervous to not challenge someone else's strongly held opinion. So we get to a fact base pretty quick.
No, great answer. And I do think sometimes energy modelers like Aurora like to abstract the energy market and turn it into equations, but you do need to stay very close to the market to understand what's happening at a trading and contracting level. Team, that was terrific. Thanks so much for your time today. We've covered an enormous amount there in 40 minutes or so. We're very appreciative. All the best, and thank you again, both Brian and Skipp.
Thanks, Hugo. Great to chat and swap notes.
Absolutely pleasure, Hugo.
That was Hugo Batten, Aurora's Managing Director for APAC and California, talking to Skipp Williamson, Founder and Managing Director of Partners in Performance, and Brian Innes, the Global Technical Director for Partners in Performance's Energy Transformation Practice. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.